Reverend Rangaga sought to understand right from the beginning how Stanley found his faith and his meaning to him. I cite this because his clarification of the impact of faith on him clearly had to be related to the people who were in need around him. His faith had something to say to the situation of the woman who was widowed as a result of the death of her husband, who died in difficult and inhumane conditions. At Mamelodi High School, he was often in conversation with children whose fathers were working as gardeners and were every day referred to as boys by their employers. He had to explain the difference between a boy who was immature and the usage of the term boy to an elderly man who had boys or sons at secondary school. The same was true of their mothers, who were referred to as girls by their employers. Stanley explained the difference in as delicate a way as a responsible teacher could, because the government of the day did not expect an educator to explain these things truthfully. The student trusted him in spite of his employer's untruthfulness. They saw the delicacy with which Stanley handled this, because he could not lie to them. He shared the truth without allowing them to be injured by the lie. Dr. Mogoba knew Mr. Sobukwe and heard him speak. Quite a number of the young men at that stage had heard Mr. Sobukwe speak. With shock, they had heard Mr. Sobukwe say the things they had known but could not say. At the heart was the truth that whatever anybody had said, this land belonged to the Africans. The other people had come and found the Africans here. Stanley lied to quote Sobukwe when Sobukwe said, the arrival of the white people was as if they came to your home and found you in the bathroom and concluded that the house is not yours because you were not there when they came. You belong to the bathroom. He argued that the best the whites could do was to find a place to be accommodated and therefore belong. But they could not claim the land as theirs. Only they could become countrymen. The fact that they came did not make them lesser countrymen. They could share the land as equals of the Africans. His assertion is well known, that the whites came and found a place that was not occupied and called it their land, and pushed harder for the Africans to move away so that they could leave them more space which they could claim for themselves. And later, when Stanley was incarcerated in the island, Sobukwe would symbolize this by bowing down to earth, pick up the soil, and lifting his hand. allow it to drop from his hand, to the thundering, answering voice of those who saw him and those who see him in the spirit. Izweletu. There's neither send away those who arrived late in this land, nor wish them to leave. It only required them to acknowledge the ownership by those they found in the land. And under the guidance of those who they found, they would live together, they would live in the land, and they would build the land as time required. It is history that Sobukwe, who said these words, was neither a violent man, nor could he stop saying Izweletu until the end of his life. He walked with white people and lived with them without rejecting them. For he saw no reason for that, as long as they could acknowledge that the land is not theirs. Stanley believed Sobukwe and saw no reason to doubt his faith. Sobukwe was a Pan-Africanist and a local preacher in the Methodist Church. In turn, Mogoba was a man who could be trusted for his views and whom the students saw as trustworthy. In Mamelodi High, the students in their frustration decided to burn the Gereformeerde Kerk in Mamelodi. Stanley advised against this, but they burned the church. The security policemen arrested Stanley for what they called advising the school children to burn the Mamelodi church. And so began Stanley's life in the island. During the 8 months in prison in Pretoria, he received no pastoral visits. He would have welcomed these, and I can see him gently welcoming them because, like Sobukwe, he had a clear conscience. But there were none. The question lingered about white people as to when they would acknowledge as belonging to the Africans and arrange to live with them according to the dictates of this confession. The white government sentenced him to 3 years in prison, and he was sent to Robben Island. In the island, it is difficult to measure the consistency of his Pan-African thought and his theology, because the people at the island tend to live similar life with less emphasis on their differences. All we can say here is that the consistency between his theology and his life as a prisoner was clear. We can see the odd instance where they saw Robert Sobukwe when they were going to work in digging dumps. We see Sobukwe's emphasis on the land as he opens his hands and drops the soil which he had earlier collected. Under the close watchful eyes of the warders, the people in the squad would bow down, pick up the soil, and slowly let it fall. Mogoba clearly made a point about his belief on the consistency of his theology against his imprisonment by not bowing down because he was beaten. A number of times he was beaten and left alone in the cell to suffer the pains of being beaten. The most dramatic case was when he had been sentenced to a life without food in a prison cell. This is where Dennis Brutus, a communist, surreptitiously dropped him a Bible. He used this opportunity to learn Xhosa because the Bible was a Xhosa one. He used the Lord's Prayer as a key with which he unlocked the other sections of the Bible. In a sense, this proved to be one time when he could reflect more on the Bible and consolidate his faith. Not only that, but Stanley started to learn a language that was foreign to him. In his theology, that proved beyond doubt that Stanley had a focused mind. He studied for his diploma in theology. He fortified himself for his journey as a theologian. But nothing happened that would raise question marks about his loyalty to the Pan-Africanist ideas. It was after his release that these efforts began to make a more meaningful impact. His mind was already set for the ministry as a discipline he could follow to satisfy, among other things, his Pan-Africanist thoughts and his theological thirst. He had expressed his longing to join the ministry to Reverend Rangaka, who was happy to prepare him. On reception by conference, Stanley was stationed in Dobsonville in the Krugersdorp circuit. Here, the security police had no problem tracing him. Within days, they were removing him and taking him back to his original place in Sekhukhuniland. His former minister, Reverend Rangaka, with his superintendent, Reverend Hudson, immediately took him as a probationer in his home circuit in Sekhukhuniland. It was unbecoming for a probationer whom the Methodist Church of Southern Africa had stationed to be denied an opportunity to minister, above all, to minister in Africa. Remember, the whole of Africa was home to the young man. And the Boers who were supposed to have got permission from him to operate in Africa were stopping him. Amazing. By the way, we owe Reverend Rangaka a belated word of gratitude. The Methodist Church must apply for the University of South Africa to give Reverend Rangaka a belated Doctor of Philosophy. He has earned it. The Methodist Church of South Africa is grateful to him. Besides exposing himself to the security police, Rev Rangaka could have said, I have done what I was supposed to do. It is now for the young man to prove himself. But instead, Reverend Rangaka said, in action, I agree with Stanley. It is further kudos to Dr. Bendy that he persuaded the stationing committee to place Stanley in Alice for further study. He put his neck on the block for the young man because what he was saying did not deserve punishment. Rather, Stanley needed to be heard because he was correct. There was resistance as some of the clergy were of the like mind as the apartheid masters that Stanley could not be of any use to anybody, including the church. They demanded that the church should drop him and not give him the privilege of being a minister to the people of God. Like John Wesley said, the world is an open parish. Therefore, Mogoba, the Methodist Church, embraced Mogoba and gave him the assurance that he could go anywhere and spread the news. In Alice, Dr. Mogoba settled on his studies, working towards an Associate of Federal Theological Seminary, an equivalent of a Bachelor of Theology degree. That is where I met him. I was the youngest student, and he was the second eldest. I deliberately sat at his feet. His bedroom was directly above mine. He did not hesitate to pour his knowledge and convictions out when requested to do so. He was a quiet person until you asked the question. For the first time, I understood the differences between the African National Congress and the Pan-Africanist Congress. This was in 1971. Night after night, I quietly went up to his room for my political education. He told me about Sobukwe and his philosophy. I understood why the fellow students at Fort Hare feared Sobukwe and moved away from him because of his views, and why his largely white teachers detested him. I was even more amazed that Stanley had a sense of peace throughout this story. He believed that Africa was supposed to teach everyone, particularly the white people who came to Africa already adults. He explained his philosophy of the land as created by God. He rejected the theory that there were things for whites and things for blacks, as if these two were different humans, while created by the same God, Father of all. He used a simple example about the usage of toilets and insisted that it is a matter of human exigencies only which tells one when to go to the toilet and which toilet to use and which door to ignore because you want to go to the toilet. The signs of black and white were not a plan of God. For everything, he demanded that it be used as a response to the original purposes rather than the dictates of the human will. Mogoba explained to me that in terms of his banning order, he could not stand and teach publicly about Robert Sobukwe. But in my case, I had asked questions, and he was going to respond to the questions I asked. What a man to offer answers. But above all, this explained why Mr. Steve Biko and Mr. Bani Pijana quietly moved to his room at night. They were going to drink in a well of information. Stanley was a well of information. I admired this man. It was during this time that the problem arose at the University of the North. After the graduation party, Abraham Tiro questioned why whites were sitting in the front row of the visitors' chairs, while some of the parents of the graduates were having to be outside watching their children graduate. At the end of that speech, not even the graduation party, Tiro was promptly removed and sent home under police guard. From then on, the students were rioting and were scattered all over the schools. The riots affected all the bush universities that were created for black people. One night I went to Stanley and asked him to help me write a paper that was demanded by those students and was to be presented at the Federal Seminary, where all the students who had scattered from the black universities were gathered. Stanley dictated the paper from the beginning till the end. The following night, I presented the paper as my own to the body of students gathered in Alice Federal Seminary Hall. I made a case for the students who were boycotting. I rejected Bantu education syllabus. I called the students to embrace the liberation of our land. I called on them to put value on those things that were ours. And I called them to love and to set free the land of Africa. There was a buzz of excitement. I had done it. As soon as I could, I made a beeline to Stanley's room. There I found a man who was quiet and who asked me, "Why did you use the sentence where you called on whites to leave?" I had been carried by the mood, and I thought I could insert the sentence with no harm. Stanley quietly reminded me that to call for the recognition of the soil is not the same as calling on whites to leave the soil. To demand a fair education is not to say white people should leave. It is to stress that they have to put Africa first in their thinking. Amazing. Mogoba believed the whites could recognize the meaning of the soil and be part of its restoration. But that could happen only when they have understood that we are equal and that we were created equal by God. In actual fact, he insisted that whites could forget their whiteness and simply be human. This is what they need to do. This is where multiracialism fell short, because it did not allow white people to grow beyond their race and become non-racial. He emphasized Stanley emphasized to me that never forget that. Never forget that the whites can grow if they want to. Dr. Mogoba never had a problem with black consciousness. In fact, he embraced it as a tool black people could use to emphasize their identity. He saw it almost the same as stressing Africanness. The black people were taking up cudgels and were prepared to lead the fight against racial oppression. He was immensely pleased that the method of the struggle of black consciousness was on focusing on students, that they should love their land, that they should love the soil. We went to the villages around Middle Drift and Alice and helped people build dams. Mogoba believed that this was the meaning of freedom, to develop the soil without waiting for someone to do it for you. Young people, he believed, had to see visions and pursue them. His subject at the seminary was church history, and the students loved listening to Mogoba as he interpreted history. It would be logical that it led to the need for the story to be told according to the views of legitimate subjects. It is no wonder that among those he taught is Professor Jerry Musala, a sharp critic of apartheid and ways and methods of apartheid. Stanley was elected chair of the Black Methodist consultation. This gave him an opportunity to lead even the ministers who were in circuit, who had never tasted what he had to offer. He stressed throughout his term the need for black people to excel in what they were doing. His addresses showed a man who was not to waste his words referring to white people. Rather, he spent his time on black people. He insisted that if white people thought there was something good in the Black Methodist consultation, instead of coming here and be part of the BMC, they should only follow black people. Nobody refused them opportunity to sit and learn from black people. Black people, wherever they are, when they have understood, they become educators of all people, black and white. This was a call into the life of those of the church, those beliefs held by indigenous people. This issue still faces the church. But the sum of these things was to follow in preparing the black people for the new world, which was to follow. It was at this time when a decision was taken by the Black Methodist consultation that when the Reverend Cyril Wilkins retired as Secretary of Conference, all efforts should be made that he is succeeded by the Reverend Mogoba. Dr. Khoza Mgojo was at this time chairman of the Natal West District. The moment this decision was taken, Reverend Otto and myself made our way to the Methodist Connectional Office. We went to see the Reverend Wilkins. We were given 10 minutes. We asked him to arrange that Reverend Mogoba succeeded him at the MCO. Instead of the 10 minutes that we were told we have, Mr. Wilkins allowed us an hour to discuss this matter with him. Soon after this meeting, Dr. Mgojo introduced the matter at the meetings of chairmen of districts. Reverend Wilkins supported him. He agreed that such a decision had to be taken by the conference, which was to be held later that year in Welkom. Dr. Mgojo insisted that the names that are taken to conference should be written down by the chairman and take them to conference. There was the name of the Reverend Vivian Harris and the name of the Reverend David Sedler. They went to conference. Dr. Mgojo advised us in the BMC that he had completed his task. And now the Black Methodist consultation had to ensure that Dr. Mogoba is elected. Remember, at the time, the majority at conference was white. Nonetheless, the BMC met and a small task force was set up. We allowed all the black people to enjoy conference, except for the 12 who were elected to pilot the resolution to make Dr. Mogoba Secretary of Conference. The work was strenuous, with every member of the task team expected to meet a number of people. We had to try and persuade people whom we had heard through rumors that they might just be open. And these were white people. We went and saw them. Some of them sent us away even as we were trying to approach them. But we knew that if Dr. Mogoba was not elected during the first ballot, he would lose the election. Because the votes of Reverend Sedler and Reverend Harris had to be brought together for the second round of voting. During that first time of voting, Stanley received 47 votes. The Reverend Harris received 23 votes. The Reverend Sedler, 17. We could only trace. Reverend Wilkins was supportive because he immediately asked that Stanley should be stationed at the MCO for the following year. This victory we will cherish forever because Stanley did well as a secretary, a job to which he was re-elected twice, giving him 9 years as Secretary of Conference. One would have thought that with so many white people becoming his friends, Stanley would be moved from his Pan-African thoughts. Not Stanley. It was during this time, as Secretary of Conference, that the Methodist Church of Southern Africa was allowed back in Transkei by the government of General Bantu Holomisa. We rejoiced. But we had to stop Methodists from going there because they all wanted to go and attack Transkei. Dr. Mgojo was the president. I phoned him and said, Dr. Mgojo, please, only you must arrange when to go to Transkei and how to go to Transkei. And immediately Dr. Mgojo sent a note around the connection telling Methodists to hold back. A few of us who were appointed to do the job brought back 85% of the Methodists from the Church of Transkei to the Methodist Church of Southern Africa. But the key was in supporting them administratively. Stanley worked on that. He did it so well that it did not feel like there was a major hiccup for those people to be back in the Methodist Church. They just smoothly went in. We, as the diplomats of the church doing the organizing on the ground, we received so much help from Stanley that we never worried that there would be a problem. That is what a good secretary does. So we say, Stanley should leave and one day rest, knowing that the people called Methodist will forever be grateful and will doff their hats to him and to his grave. His work for the New South Africa is well known. When his beloved South Africa was going through a tough and rough time, fighting a war that threatened our freedom, he joined hands with Archbishop Desmond Tutu in making peace between the African National Congress and Inkatha. He took time at the height of the destabilization process to stand side by side with me, for instance, to cause peace among the ANC and IFP hostel residents. We owe it to you, Stan. Dr. Mogoba and Dr. Mgojo lived and worked together as sons of the African soil. They cried for the new to happen in South Africa. The respect they held for each other is amazingly deep. They shared their secrets together. The highest point was in their struggles while together at the Federal Theological Seminary. They held each other's hands as they fought for the liberation of their country. And throughout that fight, they lifted high the cross of Jesus Christ. In December 1997, he laid down his fighting weapons for the church and retired. He picked up the long laid down weapons of the Pan-Africanist Congress. His message was simple. We can move from our different positions to reach the point where we feel and regard each other as Africans, as people of one race. He felt that the Africans' charitable goal of sharing their country with the people of different colors is laudable. In the same way, the people of different races needed to share in the struggle based on the belief that the soil of Africa belonged to Africans. This would be their incontrovertible contribution to the struggle. Such white people, if they avail themselves, would have earned their spurs as Africans. It was sad to see the Pan-Africanist Congress over the years torn apart by disagreements of people who had not taken time to reflect on what Mr. Sobukwe meant when he said, "Izwe lethu," and took this to mean that only black people could live in South Africa. Many whites have a fear when this is pointed out, as if it means there is no room for them in South Africa, or as if Africans do not allow them to become African. It would give those whites comfort to know that Mogoba and Sobukwe would declare that they were sons and daughters of the soil only if they learned what it meant to be Africans, learning it from the brothers and sisters who live in Africa. To have taken Africa with no attitude that they come from Europe, which is better, would enhance them. They would become undoubtedly the sons and daughters of the soil without the intention of being teachers of what is right according to European eyes. Stanley has lived with such white people. Some of them now wish they could see Africa as Stanley sees it. Many would love to be like him, a man with no prejudice, who welcomes every man or woman, provided that he or she holds none of the prejudice against the soil of Africa. We honor him. We honor his thoughts that he has often conveyed with amazing humility. For a moment we say to him, "Izwe lethu, i-Afrika."
Well, very good afternoon if you've just joined us. Of course, the annual Dr. Stanley Mogoba lectures just underway at the Glen Methodist Church in Pretoria. The Methodist Church of Southern Africa is honouring former PAC President Dr. Stanley Mogoba. In a very special way, the 88-year-old Reverend Mogoba played a significant activist role in the fight against apartheid. He was arrested back in 1963 and has spent 7 years in jail.